So now we're going to move along to hear Piers Robinson talk about understanding contemporary global power elite agendas, also from 9/11 to COVID-19. Dr. Piers Robinson has 25 years of experience researching, writing, teaching, and public speaking about international politics, communications, and propaganda. He got his PhD at the University of Bristol in 2000 and has taught at universities of Liverpool, Manchester, and Sheffield. Since leaving Sheffield in 2019, Piers has been involved in the development of a number of initiatives relating to the study of propaganda, including the establishment of the Organization for Propaganda Studies, the Working Group on Syria, Media, and Propaganda, the Working Group on Propaganda and the 9/11 Global War on Terror, and in 2022, the online journal Propaganda in Focus. He is currently part of the Berlin Group 21, which is representing issues raised by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, scientists, regarding the manipulation of chemical weapons investigations in Syria. In the last 4 years, both 9/11 and COVID-19 have become a central research concern for Piers. In particular, he has analyzed the propaganda surrounding these events and their role as structural deep events, a phrase coined by Peter Dale Scott. Since 2023, he has served as a board member and as of January 2024, as a research director of the International Center for 9/11 Justice and is co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies. So Piers, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. Okay, I'm going to just make a few comments, in a sense, initial comments about questions surrounding the political actors who we think are behind the COVID-19 event. And I mean, first and foremost, the starting point, I think, and I think most of the evidence indicates this fairly clearly now, is that COVID-19 is not a public health crisis in any accurate sense. It can't be understood in that way in any accurate sense of the term. It's essentially a political event or an economic event which has occurred, or as has been mentioned by Marilyn and also Ted, a structural deep event. And of course, this is Peter Dale Scott's concept. Now, what is a structural deep event? Well, according to Scott, and this is just a sort of potted summary of this analysis, is that essentially a structural deep event is a situation whereby an event is exploited by, sorry, I'm just going back to the correct slide. It's an event which is exploited by political elites in order to further specific agendas. And this can involve, right, instigating an event. It can also involve taking advantage of events which occur. And I'll come up to that point later on. But essentially, the picture which Peter Dale Scott paints with the idea of a structural deep event is you have networks of legitimate actors, political actors, and also illegitimate political actors, criminal or deep state actors, along with other non-democratic or unelected entities who are involved in exploiting events in order to push forward political agendas. And the critical thing, and this is why Peter Dale Scott describes these as structural deep events, is that they are events which political elites use in order to create long-standing structural change in a society. And I think with COVID-19, the evidence is fairly clear. It will probably be pretty clear to many of the viewers of this live stream. But just to go through the basic indicators, and this is based upon work that we're developing within IC 911 in terms of identifying components of structural deep events and so on. But COVID-19 has all the telltale signs of a structural deep event, as Peter Dale Scott would understand it. You have, of course, evidence of foreknowledge and planning in relation to COVID-19. So we have the infamous Event 201 in October of 2019 involving the World Health Organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, etc., essentially gaming or creating scenario planning for a major coronavirus global pandemic. There's plenty of other examples of foreknowledge and preparation in the run-up to the official declaration of a pandemic. You have the World Health Organization, for example, in late November issuing tweets saying everyone should be scared. The next big virus pandemic is just around the corner, and so on. And you also have, of course, really sort of in late December of 2019, and this is prior to the sort of formal identification of China telling the World Health Organization of the sort of the process of declaring a global emergency. You have, for example, contracts being issued for the production of a vaccine in relation to this virus, and other indicators of preparation. And then when you get into January, literally just as where the first information is being passed over to the World Health Organization about a new pneumonia of unknown etiology, etc., you already have sort of planning and processes being put in place. You have Drosten and the PCR test. In fact, Drosten working on the PCR test prior to New Year's Eve in 2020. And getting the PCR tests in place, which, as Niels described, this became a critical mechanism which essentially enabled them to construct the perception of a major global pandemic. So foreknowledge and planning, and again, that parallels to a large extent with what we see with 9/11. There's plenty of evidence of foreknowledge, etc., in the run-up to 9/11. And of course, all of the game planning on regime change wars, and that information has come to light over time through testimony, but also through documents, etc. But you have substantial evidence of actors in the know, knowing of something big which is about to occur, and the evidence is very clear with that with COVID-19. Second key feature, you have this rapid reaction to events that you see with COVID-19. Mentioned PCR tests already being devised literally as China is informing the World Health Organization of an unknown pneumonia affecting a small number of people. You have throughout January of 2020, you then have the Davos, the World Economic Forum conference, and you have tabletop discussions there talking about, well, this looks like it's going to be the big one. And so really within 6 or 7 weeks, and actually when, according to Paul Schreier, the actual the COVID-19 levels were dropping in China, you have the declaration of a global pandemic occurring. All of this with minimal sort of investigation and establishment scientifically of there being a major dangerous pandemic. And this is one of the things that you see very clearly if you go back through the chronology and the timeline. That there's no moment there that you can identify where you have credible scientists saying, look, we have a really dangerous virus on the loose and it's harming lots of people. We need to do something. You don't have any of that. You have careful, methodical planning, actions being taken and so on through the course of December and January, all pointing towards this being essentially an instigated structural deep event. Of course, again, the parallel there with 9/11 is very clear. When 9/11 occurred, within days, you saw the firming up of the regime change war planning, attacking multiple countries. Within 3 or 4 days, a British embassy cable was informing the British government that, well, the hawks in Washington are going to use 9/11 now to start a series of wars to clear up other problems in the international system, etc. So that kind of rapid reaction or rapid activity immediately following an event with minimal investigation. And then, of course, with 9/11, it rolled into the invasion of Afghanistan very quickly. And with COVID-19, again, the same process of just suddenly, rapidly reacting without very little evidence in support and implementing essentially with COVID-19 a state of crisis, of a medical emergency on a global level. Manipulation of science is key feature that we've seen with 9/11 in terms of, for example, the manipulation of scientific investigations into the building collapses. COVID-19, we see the same process. Mentioned already, the PCR test rushed through peer review, and then that became the way of identifying and in a sense, sort of creating this impression of a global, rapidly spreading pandemic. You have obviously there's been a large amount written on the way in which purported deaths attributed to COVID-19 were being recorded and so on, and exaggerating essentially the death toll, which could be linked to any particular virus. So you have those kind of processes of manipulation going across both of these cases, which again points to the way in which elites are manipulating the event. They have to manipulate public perceptions and understanding. They have to manipulate the science in order to maintain the narrative. The fourth characteristic, which is a telltale sign of a structural deep event, manipulation of media and propaganda. We see it obviously with 9/11. 9/11, very, very quickly, the media got on board with the official US narrative, and of course, also very quickly got on board with the wars, which were then prosecuted in the international system. Minimal questioning from the media about, well, is it even a good idea to respond to 9/11 through this military war, global war against terror, etc. Media pretty much became mouthpieces for the official position and also for the promotion of the wars that we saw following 9/11. COVID-19, again, there's, despite the level of censorship that there is on mainstream academia, there's still some studies starting to come out now, and it shows the role of media manipulation and propaganda in the case of COVID-19. Most prominently, and keeping in mind that there's two sides of the coin of propaganda. One is promotion, the other is censorship. We saw very, very early on dissenting scientists being pretty brutally suppressed, pushed off social media and so on, smeared, etc., in order to shut down any kind of critical questioning of what was going on. Examples abound, of course. We saw these images coming from China of people who are apparently falling dead from COVID-19 on the spot, etc. All strong indications of major propaganda campaigns and significant manipulation of the media in this case. The final telltale sign with COVID-19, as with the 9/11 structural deep event, the hidden agenda was to initiate a series of major regime change wars in the international system. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Iran, these are all the countries which were being tabled for military action prior to 9/11, and you see the documents sort of coming out immediately after 9/11 through the British inquiries, which confirmed that this was the kind of planning that was going on. So that was your hidden agenda there, was to start regime change wars, which had very, very little to do with fighting Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. With COVID-19, I mean, many would argue that the agendas aren't particularly hidden, that with COVID-19, we saw, of course, that the push for the Great Reset, which was a kind of a structural political, economic vision about how our society should be organized. Others have argued that there's a key economic component to the COVID-19 structural deep event. So there was a drive to try and solve a crisis within the finance markets, within the repo markets, and this created the Going Direct plan, which was in plan months before COVID hit, which was then implemented and accelerated as we saw the process of lockdowns and so on during COVID-19. So you had an economic agenda, you have a political agenda, and there are other arguments in circulation there, which I might pick up on later, as to what was the sort of driving force behind COVID-19 as a structural deep event. So I think the telltale sign is very clear. What this question raises inevitably, with 9/11, we know this is PNAC trying to start a global war, attacks on countries, and using the 9/11 deception in order to mobilize the public to do that. With COVID-19, broadly speaking, there have been two, as far as I read the literature at the moment, two broad arguments have emerged about how do we understand the actors behind this. One is rooted around this notion of a global power elite. Operating, some describe it as a class block. Case van der Pijl's work, States of Emergencies, talk about an emergence of a high-tech pharma class block operating on a global level, involving the big corporations, global oligarchy, transnational power elite class bloc, and so on, operating through major financial actors, Bank for International Settlements, and also through institutions such as the World Health Organization, World Economic Forum, United Nations. And associated with this kind of analysis is that there's a lot of infiltration of government by these actors. And really, the broad picture that's painted here is that you have a relatively unified globalist elite bloc, which is driving the COVID-19 event, responsible for its instigation, certainly responsible for its exploitation for various political agendas. Now, there is a tendency from this point of view to downplay or to de-emphasize certain components of what we see in the world around us. Some people who argue for the kind of global power elite bloc being behind this tend to shift attention away from the ongoing conflicts that we see in the international system, Ukraine, Palestine, the Middle East situation. Also tend to shift attention away from what some people would describe as the geopolitical situation, BRICS, China, the Russian Federation, and the broader shifts in distribution of power in the international system, shifts in ideational, economic, and military power away from the West and towards China, Russia, and to the global South. Tendency to de-emphasize, some would say, is a blind spot. The second sort of broad position is that the picture described is very similar. You have major corporations who are involved in the construction, instigation of the COVID-19 event. Same actors in play, World Health Organization, World Economic Forum. But the emphasis from this perspective as to understanding what's driving the COVID-19 event is that these are primarily Western-centric power elites who are behind this, who are driving this. But there's a fourth component to this analysis, which is different from the kind of globalist analysis, and that's that the political, military, economic power struggles that we're seeing in the international system at the moment are still very important and do reflect genuine conflict between elite blocs in the international system. And so there you see the unipolarity, multipolarity debates occurring. Now, as with the first sort of hypothesis or theory about what's driving this approach also has a tendency to de-emphasize certain elements of what we can see out there in terms of what's happening in the world. There is a tendency, not from all people from this position, but at least some of them, to downplay or to have a less developed understanding of the relationship between the transnational elites and financial actors, and how they link back down to nation states. So this sort of interface between nation states, major powers, transnational corporations, and global oligarchs, I think is not fully or adequately mapped in that sense. And there's also a tendency to underestimate what I think is there, how strong it is up for debate, the globalist power elite network, this sort of very highly ideological bloc which has been pushing, for example, transhumanism, pushing the fourth industrial revolution, and so on. So sometimes with a kind of Western-centric analysis of what's driving COVID-19, it's the Western power elites behind this rather than the globalist power elites. There is a tendency to not sort of pay sufficient attention to that component of what we see going on. There are others in this position who really fall down into not paying any attention at all to COVID-19. I don't want to get into that territory, but that's certainly sort of one element of what we see out there. And I think what this has all created is that in terms of us trying to understand from a sociological or from a political science point of view of understanding what's going on, what is driving what we are seeing in front of us, there's a tendency to create blind spots or tunnel vision, where some people are simply focusing upon the Western power elites, the military-industrial complex and the wars, and then others who are just simply focusing upon what they perceive to be a globalist elite who are driving what's going on. And this causes, I think, clear blind spots and in a sense, an inability to have a more holistic understanding of the kind of power dynamics that we have in play at the moment. How do we get beyond this? Moving forward. Whoops. There we go. Moving forward. First of all, I mean, the first thing to say about this, just for some closing remarks, I mean, all of these ideas is essentially work in process. I'm working with Kevin Ryan, developing a paper on the 9/11 COVID-19 comparison. Did a paper with Vanessa Beeley published through UK Column, talking about some of these issues of the power dynamics. So this is work in progress and being developed. But I think first and foremost, it's very clear that you can have cooperation and conflict in the international system at the same time. So it's entirely plausible to have cooperation between elite power blocs over COVID-19, for example, between the major power centers in the world, whilst you also have conflict going on. The wars that we're seeing in Ukraine, the kind of battle over the global economic financial system, and so on. So, we need to recognize that there's a possibility for cooperation and conflict, and that can change over time. Second point is that a lot of people in these two broad camps do tend to work with a set of assumptions or black boxes about what they think is behind COVID-19. And the problem with that is that, assumptions and black boxes, you always have to work with, assumptions to some extent, but you need to justify the assumptions. And I think the problem is that not enough work has been done in order to sufficiently understand the actors and the relationships between them in order to be confident in those assumptions. So there is a kind of a tendency to proceed in a sense of people have a worldview about what they think is important and unimportant, and then proceed according to that worldview. And I think that's problematic because it creates these blind spots or tunnel vision that I've been talking about. The third point, and this is, just trying to be as objective about this as possible, a level of circumspection and recognition of uncertainties is important whenever you're going about trying to understand complex phenomena. And for sure, understanding COVID-19, the array of global actors, the international system, understanding all this is extremely complex. If you look at the field of international relations scholarship, you have big areas of research going on for decades, looking at the international system in radically different ways without any agreement between the realists, the liberals, the Marxists, and so on and so forth. So some kind of recognition, I think, of the uncertainties of our knowledge is important. But this comes to the final point, and this really goes back to the kind of two broad sort of accounts or perspectives that I've been describing, is that all of this is amenable to rigorous empirical analysis. Network analysis, for example, is a tool that we have, a sociological tool, which allows us to map interests, actors, relationships between them. And I think that kind of work, although laborious and painstaking and takes a lot of time and resources, but that kind of work, I think, is essential in order to start to get a better understanding of what's driving COVID-19, how the COVID-19 event interfaces with the other major changes we're seeing in the international system, shifts in the distribution of power, the military conflicts, and so on. And, we have to sort of really get our heads down and buckle down with that kind of rigorous empirical analysis through network analysis in order to get a better grasp of the various theories that there are out there as to who and what is behind the COVID-19 event. And that is my presentation. Thank you.
Piers, thank you very much. That was tremendous. That was very illuminating and clarifying. And I think it's very important to emphasize that we shouldn't have such a high degree of certainty, and that there's much still to be studied and understood, which is a challenge because we also want to be able to respond quickly when these types of events start to unfold. We want to be able to resist them, and yet, so you have both of these tendencies at play, and it's difficult to navigate. But certainly from an academic perspective and trying to understand things deeply, we have to be circumspect. So I appreciate that. I do want to, Piers mentioned his paper on the UK Column website. I just want to point out the title of that, Understanding Power Dynamics and Moving Beyond Divisions. And you can find that, I believe, still linked on the homepage of the UK Column website. Very, very clarifying and elucidating. I also want to say Piers's paper, Cock Up or Conspiracy, is very helpful for kind of understanding the layers of motivations and agendas that are possibly at play with the COVID-19 event specifically. And so that's on a number of platforms. If you Google Cock Up or Conspiracy, you can find that one. And yeah, so thank you so much, Piers.